Okay, so I go as SJ, so that I want to make everyone's life a little bit easier, but I'm Sudharman Jayaweera. I'm from National Science Foundation. In the new Directorate, Technology Innovation and Partnerships, I'm a program director who is responsible for emerging technologies, specifically focused in this area, wireless networks. So I'm an IPA. I have been with TIP Directorate for about 8 months now. And I'm happy to say that I have been pretty active coordinating with our government partners, the other agencies, and very happy to be here and moderating this session. So let me get my panel up on stage. So I have from DoD Future Office, Dr. Martin Weiss, and from NTIA Wireless Innovation Fund, Amanda Toman, and from DHS, Sridhar, Kowdley, and Richard Rouil from NIST. Go ahead. All right, okay, so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to let each one of these panelists introduce themselves. And while they're doing that, maybe they can answer the question why they are interested in Open RAN. In particular, why their agencies are interested in Open RAN. So who wants to start from one end? All right, Martin, you
I'll start, sure. So my name is Martin Weiss. I'm the Director for Applied Research in the Future G office. And in Tom's presentation this morning, you saw the different lines of effort that he had. I lead the Resilient Open Commercial Solutions effort, as well as the Integrated Sensing and Communications lines of effort. The Open RAN effort falls within the ROCKS portfolio, as we call it, and so it is in my area. But I've been interested in these different innovative approaches to, or different approaches to innovation for quite a long time, even before I started my IPA last summer. So I like to break things, break institutional structures to see what else is possible. And I don't mean that in a destructive way, but I think there's a lot of room for innovation. I just kind of look back over time and see what kinds of things that have been possible with open source, going back to, Berkeley Unix and some of the internet technologies that emerged. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, and as Tom pointed out, in the military we have some particular interests as well, because we don't want to build a lot of unique independent systems. We want to build systems that we can deploy quickly and interoperate with each other. And so I'll just leave it at that, and other people can talk too.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda Toman. I am the director of the Public Wireless Supply Chain Innovation Fund out of NTIA. And prior to coming to NTIA, I was with OSD R&E, doing 5G and working for Tom. So I think what really drew me to come to NTIA was the opportunity for $1.5 billion to try and influence and have an impact in Open RAN and how it potentially could change telecommunications and how it could have an impact on the United States, on our national security, building out resiliency and security for our country. So the Innovation Fund is a $1.5 billion fund. It's congressionally mandated to go after adoption of open and interoperable networks. So it sounds like a lot of money, but I think in the grand scheme of things, when we're coming up against the telco providers of the world that are spending billions of dollars a year on research and development, we need to be really strategic about how we are thinking about applying the resources that we have, not just me at the Innovation Fund, but working across the interagency and trying to figure out how we can align and make a bigger bang for our buck when we are trying to make these investments, and recognizing that we need industry partnership, We need to be a catalyst, but we need industry's buy-in and help to make this a reality. So I'm really excited about the opportunity that we have at NTIA, about the funding, and working across the interagency to try to enable a truly open and interoperable telecommunications network.
Yeah. Hello, I'm Sridhar Kowdley with DHS Science and Technology. So those of you that may or may not know, DHS S&T is the research arm for all DHS. We have 22 operational components, but we also serve as the central point for research and development for first responders nationwide. So our interest for being here and specifically looking at things is a number of things. I think to echo what's been said here already, especially with Amanda, with resiliency, we are very interested in developing an open system that is sustainable. We think the cost model for public safety tends to be very rigid stovepipe systems that don't afford technology integration, that doesn't provide for health and safety of not only public safety, but for property as well as Homeland Security missions. So that's why we are extremely interested in being here. And just an FYI, we don't develop a lot of the networks. We leverage network technologies capabilities and those provided by carriers and industry providers. So as much as we can influence resiliency, sustainability, technology integration, that's kind of our interest and our sweet spot.
My name is Richard Rouil. I'm with the NIST. I'm the chief of the Wireless Networks Division, part of the Communications Technology Laboratory. I've been at NIST for over 20 years and looking at, doing research in wireless communications for a long time. So NIST is, we've been working in Open RAN for a few years now. It aligns with NIST's mission, which is to advance innovation and US competitiveness through measurement science and standards. And Open RAN, is definitely fitting for such a mission to, help US industry compete, in this global market and to, through the disaggregation, the opening, some of the supply issues. Our division specifically, we are aiming to work with industry and academia and other governments to look at any technology that will change how the networks are operated. So again, Open RAN introduces many changes, disaggregation, the risks that change how we would use and optimize the network. So that's the reason why we are involved in this Open RAN.
All right, so that's it, right? We wrap up.
Let's
go. Okay, all right, so I'm going to ask a follow-up question. So you heard that why each of these agencies are interested in Open RAN. Now, the Open RAN is just the open standardized interfaces for the RAN. But why are you interested in open source Open RAN? In terms of achieving each one of your agency goals, how do you see open source Open RAN implementations can help? Maybe Sridhar is leaning forward to go first.
Sure, yeah, so a couple of things. So I work for, obviously, S&T, I've mentioned it, but I didn't mention the fact that we actually have an office within S&T called the Office for Interoperability and Compatibility. It was stood up after 9/11, specifically to address interoperability issues. So for one of our key requirements, and we're congressionally legislated to do, is to actually look at testing networks and communication systems, emerging communications for emergency operations. So we are specifically interested in the open capabilities and open source and open software, because we think that is going to be the next evolution of networks. Stovepipe systems, as I mentioned, are a non-starter for us, especially in emergency operations. we're not talking about clear sky and sunny days. We're talking about a disaster. We're talking about a Maui. How do you reconstitute networks? To have an open environment with equipment and software solutions that can easily and gracefully reconstitute themselves. We don't have to worry about which vendors are coming in. If we truly have an interoperable solution, we should be able to plug and play with whatever we've got. It also addresses supply chain issues. So a number of things that are to be gained here, and I'll certainly turn it over.
Go ahead.
Okay, great. So in assuming the leadership role at NTIA for the Innovation Fund, started thinking about what are the biggest challenges towards adoption of open and interoperable networks. And I think there's really two big challenges, one of which is convincing mobile network operators will be valuable to them. But second is the area of interoperability, right? So how do we, or how could we as the government or industry potentially enable more akin to plug and play for the radio access network? And what is the best way to enable that functionality to take place? So we've been talking through this concept quite a bit across the interagency with industry, and this concept of a minimum viable profile. So something to enable vendors, up-and-coming vendors that are new into the ecosystem, that are having a really hard time breaking through to mobile network operators, to have a fundamental understanding of what functions, feature sets are really minimally required for their equipment to be able to go into the network. So with that understanding, the thought would be that vendors that are new and up and coming, they will understand what they need to be able to provide, so it will be easier to ingest those components into a mobile network environment. So that concept has somewhat taken hold, and we've got Addis leading a working group right now to start to draft what a minimum viable profile needs to be. And so far, so good. Folks are progressing and there's contributions happening. But I think that is really one of those first steps towards open and interoperable, at least starting to understand minimally what are those features and functions that are required, and then looking to that next step of that open source software, open source code that would potentially come after that, I think would be a nice logical next step to build upon the work that industry is taking on. So I really see open source and the vision to get there for the radio access network as an enabler to truly making this a reality. So I think we're on a pathway to that, but just trying to urge industry and folks in the room to participate and to provide input where needed, and start to think about how that open source software needs to look to really enable this ecosystem to take off.
I mean, I think for us, you've heard Tom talk earlier about the velocity of innovation. We're in the Future G office, and we want to develop a framework and a set of resources for performers in the defense sphere to innovate rapidly. A lot of these will also translate into, even though we have niche applications in the DoD, a lot of these we think will transition in different ways to the commercial world. So coming up with a hardened software base that we can leverage for our purposes, but that industry can leverage for the commercial rollout of these technologies, we think is going to be better for everybody. And so, we see our role as kind of absorbing some of the initial risk on building this initial open source base that we can use and that everybody can use, not just in industry, but across government. I mean, we're as Amanda and Sridhar and Richard were saying, we've been talking to all of these agents. We've been talking to anybody who will listen and anybody who wants to engage with us about having this be a whole of government approach, because we think it's only when we do this together that we can really move the needle on the industry and put U.S. competitiveness back on the map. That's really something that we hear from from Congress, from the White House all the time.
Yeah, I mean, NIST is a big fan of open source. We release a lot of open source tools, and I mean, what's discussed this morning, presented already, right? The open source is already part of Open RAN, right? You have the RAN software community was kind of like created, at the beginning of the RAN Alliance, and we see that the open source is going to help, as was mentioned this morning also, innovation, right? So that people would be able to build on top of something that's already accessible and not have to start from scratch. That could also help achieve, lowering the barrier of entries for new and smaller companies, right, who don't have the resources to necessarily acquire some large commercial equipment. So just to help and spur innovation. And also open source in some ways could also, for testing, it's also something we are looking at. Can you have sets of open source tests that would, again, help just make it easier, just advance, so you don't have to start from, the beginning every time. So it's something we will see as being very useful.
Well, thank you. So to add to that, from NSF point of view, the NSF, of course, funds the R&D research, basic research, but also technology translation and technology development efforts under the new directorate that I'm part of, the Technology Innovation and Partnerships. So from NSF point of view, we are interested in open source, not just in the context of RAN, but also wherever it is applicable in the wireless network. And it could be open source software or open source hardware, or even more general concepts as open spectrum and all that. So from NSF point of view, in other words, the openness is kind of we embrace as part of pushing forward research enterprise. Now, I wanted to ask Martin, because I know Martin is very much interested in how history of the wireless networks have got us to this place. So maybe you can kind of put this moment, open source, open RAN, in the context of the wireless networks, how it has developed up to now. I know that you have been looking at that, so maybe we can understand where we are and where we might expect to end up.
How many hours do I have?
You have 5 minutes. I know Martin would like to talk a couple of hours, but let's give 5 minutes.
I'm just joking. No, I mean, so, I had been thinking a little bit about, why Open RAN in the first place and how open source fits into that. Why disaggregate this? Because, I mean, we have a functioning RAN industry that's not built on Open RAN. And when you start looking across industries, in the PCs, I mean, computing, for instance, we started off with monolithic systems. Think about the IBM mainframes in the 1960s. You had, application, operating systems, networking was all one package. It began to disintegrate, partly because we got experience with that. So well, I have to throw in a term. So a lot of my research kind of sits at the boundary of technology and economics. So I throw in a lot of economics terms because it's influenced my thinking. So in institutional economics, they use this term of transaction costs, which includes, all of the things that involve risk, that involve concluding a transaction successfully. And when transaction costs are high, we tend to see these integrated systems. And early in the stages of development of a technology, we don't know exactly what we're doing. And so we tend to put the service provision and the equipment development together because they kind of have to co-evolve. I mean, think about what happened in the telephone industry where, AT&T had equipment manufacturing, they had Bell Labs, they had all of these things under one roof because all of these things had to be co-developed. And I mean, again, I could point to lots of examples, but even something simple like switching from the battery in the telephone to a common battery in the 1920s, that was a huge transition that had to take place, and it could only take place when these things were closely integrated. We could see the similar kinds of things that happened in computing, and yet at some point we discovered that, gee, maybe the transaction costs aren't that high, and we started disaggregating these things, and the innovation that happened afterwards, both in hardware and in software, were immense. I mean, just think about what happened in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and even to today in terms of how computing evolved. Would that have happened if systems were integrated? I mean, I have my answer, but I'll leave that question hanging just for you to answer for yourselves. And so in the wireless systems, I think we've kind of evolved into the similar kind of a pathway, right? Where we started off in the 1G especially, where you had a close relationship between equipment providers and service development, and we were just figuring out how do you do mobile service in the first place, and so you had to have this kind of a link. This probably, I mean, we could make that argument that through the different Gs that occurred, this was also true, but maybe we're at the point now where the transaction costs are sufficiently low that we can break this open. And that's kind of what the Open RAN postulates, really. It's the challenge that Open RAN in general is trying to address. And the open source is a part of reducing those transaction costs, reducing the friction that it takes in order to put systems together. So,
All right, okay, thank you. Anybody want to add to that?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is I think both of you mentioned it a little bit, and maybe Richard as well, but cybersecurity, building on that foundation of if you have a really good lock solid, and I think Dr. Rando mentioned, having the zero trust architecture baked in, it then now frees us up to, I think we're evolving to the point where network may be a service, and then it's really more about content feature, as you were mentioning, and looking at new capabilities. For example, we're really looking at the thing, the holy grail that has not been solved. We're looking at RIC and near to real-time RIC, as well as densification of 5G for indoor positioning. We still don't know where firefighters are. We still don't know where the public is to go search, rescue. We need those kinds of capabilities that are enabled by developed technologies. So that's kind of what we're looking at.
Well, that's kind of worrisome when Sridhar says that we don't know where the firefighters are.
Know.
So anyway, so so my next question is, how does the government agencies actually contribute to the open source and Open RAN? I know there's a concerted effort to push for the open source Open RAN implementations as well as deployments, but can you speak to each of the agencies' contributions toward that specifically maybe? You want to go first? Okay.
Sure, I will go first. So, like I mentioned in the opening, we have $1.5 billion to distribute over 10 years. We recognize that we probably need to inject those resources as quickly as possible. So we are moving quickly to try and make that happen. But in terms of how much funding, which I presume most of you are interested in, right, would be up for grabs for things like open source software. I think it's still yet to be determined, right? And I can't divulge exactly what is on our roadmap coming up. But the point I think is really important is this minimum viable profile work that is happening at ADIS is something that we're not funding. We've gotten industry to be able to take hold of this concept and to start to put together what that needs to be. So that's not to say that I don't think the government shouldn't come in and maybe be a little bit of a catalyst to start the open source ecosystem. I think there are definitely opportunities across the government for ourselves to potentially inject funds there. I think the bigger ask across folks in this room is how can you participate now without government funding, and sort of what is that line, and trying to recognize that there's a balance, right? At the end of the day, funding the minimum viable profile is not something I really wanted to do because I don't think the government should own that. I think it should be something that the industry owns and takes hold of, right? So what's that line between the government catalyzing something and at the end of the day, or the Department of Commerce shouldn't own open source software, nor should the Defense Department, right? It should be industry owned, should be open. How do we facilitate that happening and ensuring that there's a right balance? So I don't know that it's a perfect answer, but I think it's a discussion point that needs to continue, and we need to keep talking and open communication with industry to make sure that there's a balance and that the little injects of government money will be picked up and carried forward by our industry partners.
That's actually a good point. I would like the others to probably address that point as well as how you contribute to open source, Open RAN community.
Yeah, I mean, so I totally agree that, you know, our role really is to catalyze, to absorb risk that industry wouldn't be willing to take on their own, right? We kind of want to get momentum going and then turn it over. Not to say we want to turn it over and have hands off, but you know, it's ultimately up to the industry to build this, to own this. If we can, I think our role is to, like I said, help start, as Amanda said, to catalyze, I think is a perfect word for it. And I think we're completely in alignment on that.
Anything to add, Sridhar?
Yeah, sure. Wanted to kind of introduce my good friend Richard here. So in the same vein that we're talking about, you know, Amanda talked about minimal viable product profile, excuse me, forgive me. We're along the same lines. We're looking at the OTEC process. We're looking at, so we're actually funding in partnership with NIST to take a look at the OTEC process. How much testing is sufficient? Again, for industry, that might be different than what US government needs. So we're looking at, you know, discussions with the team here. How much testing is enough? What kind of cyber testing do we need to do? What is the optimum test suite? And so, as Amanda mentioned, and I think Martin recommended, that we are just at this point incubators or sort of catalysts to drive things. Just to kind of give you an example, we have the same problem with next-gen 911. We're having all kinds of interoperability problems with vendors building subcomponents, and the idea is we want the next generation or evolution of 911 to be send video, send text, send images, send, you know, and have AI, ML in the background helping public safety. So we're actually funding Texas A&M to build a test lab to say this is what's required. In the same vein, we want to sort of take a look at the OTIC process and give that back to the community and say, here's our recommendations, and so that if anybody wants to build a product for US government, they know the rules, right? Because it's always risk, reward, funding, business opportunity, and revenue. So if we can define what we need, it helps industry say, okay, here's the market, here's what I need to do. And so I think it helps everybody. Over to you.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, one of the things, I guess, to contribution is that we discuss among the different agencies, right? That's one of the key also that we see that value in Open RAN, and we have coordinated efforts. At least in particular, so the program that we have on Open RAN has, 4 focus areas. One is security that Sridhar mentioned already. We are looking at the testing. We are looking at Zero Trust architecture. The team in the division led this, the Zero Trust architecture document from NIST that described Zero Trust, and we are active participant of the ORAN Alliance. We were, I think, the first government agency to join the ORAN Alliance a couple years ago, and so we're active in the Working Group 11 security. We actually, this week, the NIST is hosting the interim Working Group 11 at NIST. So that's an effort that's ongoing. We're also participating in Working Group 6 on cloud. So active there to, again, look at the testing, the TIFG also. And so that's on the security. We're also looking at interoperability, right? Developing new methods to test interoperability. So beyond, conformance testing, that maybe is the focus of the ON Alliance, but really looking at, towards this plug and play. How can you, if you want to swap, components, and really what's the level of interoperability that you would get? How can you measure, right, that they will actually behave the way you want it if you have to swap them on the fly? I mean, I guess, so something we're looking at. The third one is AI machine learning. We're interested in that, in how do we, develop new algorithms to automate the network, enhance performance, but we're also looking at it from, how do we generate data sets that could be used to train new machine learning algorithm or evaluate? Because innovation is great, but then people are saying, well, we get this much gain, we get this performance, but there's no baseline really to kind of see, compared to what. So we're interested in that. And then the fourth area is actually open source. So that was actually something we decided from the beginning, that we wanted to look at deploying, an end-to-end test bed based on open source components. So that's something that we've been investigating to put those pieces and kind of look at the state, the maturity of those components. We have also a commercial, Open RAN test bed as well, but open source is a key focus for us. And we'd like to, feed, our contribution would be on lessons learned, guides, to document what we could do.
Can I have a quick follow-up? So, one of the things, just listening to everybody on the panel, and I really loved all of your comments, I hear the word risk coming up all the time, reducing risk. One of the things that, you who are building products and developing products, you can help us by telling us, what the risks are that you're perceiving, because that'll help us form our strategies.
Well, thank you. So, well, Tom said that he went 15 minutes without mentioning AI. I think we made about 40 minutes. Yeah, so, but still it came up. So anyway, okay, so thank you for that. I was going to say at the end of the panel, we didn't mention AI, but there goes that. So, okay, so the next question, actually, I want to leave a little bit of time so that we can get a couple of questions from the audience to my panelists. But before that, I want to also ask so there are several now open source, Open RAN efforts, right? And also NSF in partnership with DoD FutureG, we were looking at the Okudu to develop an open source code base. But what I want to ask is from different agency perspective, how do you evaluate the current existing open source, Open RAN efforts, and what else we need? What is lacking in those if we want to advance this wider at-scale adoption of Open RAN and open source Open RAN, what would you like to see from these current efforts in addition to what we have already? So anyone can go first.
All right, maybe I can start it. Yeah, so as I mentioned, we decided we wanted to set up an open source based Open RAN test bed. So for the past couple of years, we've been investigating several options that I guess people are familiar. I don't need to name them, but it's been mixed success. I think they're definitely great platforms, but putting them together and sometimes having it to deploy them in a setup that is slightly different from what is being documented, then introduces a lot of challenges. And I think that's something that we hear from others as well. That it takes several months sometimes to just get something together. And all Open RAN, is a complex system, right? It's got a lot of components that need to be, you need to put together, and then the rigs and the SMOs and all the stuff. So they are great products. What we'd like to see, I guess, a wish list for moving forward is maybe some better coordination amongst some of those solutions, right, to ease the integration, which I guess the integration is a key to Open RAN, even with the commercial products. So that there is the, and maybe the minimum viable profile, it would be a useful way for the open source to say, okay, these would be functionalities that we need to also start supporting. But even just among, like the, just because it's something that we've experienced, like the E2 interface is just, the specs are so complex and there's flexibility. So how they decide to implement it is different. And again, so some coordination, just because you say you support the same interface, just doesn't mean you can talk to them. Going back to how do you evaluate interoperability, right? You could be conformant to the interface specification, but you still can't interoperate, right? So some coordination would be great. I heard this morning about the blueprint. There was something also that we wanted to bring up. Like there are some initiatives here and there that we hear about blueprints, but really, like how do we move forward with that? What would that actually look like? The scope of those blueprints is something that would be very interesting.
So I'll follow on a little bit. This is a bit of a preview, I think, to the panel this afternoon. But as part of the Innovations Fund's first rollout of funding, we stood up test and evaluation laboratories and also R&D efforts to look into test and evaluation to look at things like interoperability and energy efficiency and security. So you'll hear from, I think, 3 of the panelists or the representatives from the laboratories that were standing up, but recognizing that, we are adding to the sort of OTIC lab base, but using those as a resource to potentially leverage once these open source software code sets become available, inject them into the laboratories to validate interoperability and performance. And, really recognizing, I think, the opportunity and value that we have, right? So that these labs will be stood up for multiple years. And I would hope that they are leveraged across the vendor industrial base as a resource to go in and evaluate performance, interoperability, and like Richard said, just because you're compliant with the specification doesn't necessarily mean that it enables plug and play. So being that resource, I hope, will be helpful, and continuing to hear where there are gaps or needs, and using that feedback loop or the laboratories as a feedback loop to help the government determine, if there's technology gaps that a little bit of funding might be able to resolve and push things forward. But continuing to communicate the output of what we're seeing at those laboratories, those R&D efforts across our ecosystem so that we're aware of those types of things and use it as a feedback loop.
Yeah, so, excuse me, we really appreciate the open source code bases that are out there. Especially in the applied research portfolio, we're doing early stage research. So a lot of our performers are using those to advance other aspects, the kinds of projects that have the more military-oriented applications that we're looking at. But we also have a performer who's trying to get the different open source code bases to work together, OAI and SRS on CUs and DUs. And I think these are all useful from a research and development standpoint because, for example, this one performer, GTRI, was able to contribute back into the OAI code base based on things that they found. Again, I think that's useful for discovery. It helps the open source code bases, and it kind of helps show what's the level of work that still needs to be done as we move towards an open source code base.
Do you want to add anything, Sridhar?
No, I think you guys covered it really well. From our perspective, selfishly, we're looking for, something that is able to test faithfully and provide the rigor that we need for US government to support our applications and our end users. So I think what you guys said is spot on. The only other piece that would be interesting to us would be what kind of level of documentation will we need? What is the process for us to provide feedback to the OTECs, and how do we drive the governance, if you will? That's always a challenge, right? Because again, how much testing is enough and how much testing is too much that nobody wants to do it. So having that process laid out, I think, is critical. But you guys nailed all of it.
So I'm an academic before I came to NSF, so I have to throw something about the academia also. So how can academics can get involved in open source, open RAN efforts? Do you see any specific concerns or any specific ways that the academia can contribute more than what they are doing now? And maybe you can place that in the context of workforce development, one of the main kind of objectives right now of the USG.
Yeah. All right. Happy to jump on that one.
All right.
Thank you. So
he's going to buy me a beer afterwards.
That's right. So there's been a long history of academic engagement in open source projects, much of it with the generosity of NSF funding, honestly. In academia, I'm also I won't say recoverment, and I'm completely an academic in my nature, I guess. You need this funding in order to advance your career. We need funding for early career professors to work on this. I think about a lot of what we know about operating systems today came from Berkeley Unix, which was an open source project that received lots of NSF funds. Probably, I would venture to guess that even companies like Cisco had at its core Berkeley Unix operating systems that were eventually modified and tuned for particular applications. So I think academia can play a large role, and I think it does play into workforce development as well, not just for the my career track professors. I mean, we have those concerns as well in academia, but also, we can have small elements of this that you can bring into undergraduate classrooms. So not everybody needs to be a PhD in this. We can have master's students working on some aspects of these. I mean, again, there's a long history of success with open source projects in academia, and just having the availability of a code base that you can access and use and modify and break, and you can't, I can't overstate the value of that.
Anybody else want to add?
I think Martin's right. The NSF funding is the perfect model to help academics for building out those open source resources. So the part of what we funded with our first NOFO is a bit more aligned with the R&D efforts, right? So some of it went to academic institutions, so making sure that the data that comes out of that is shared appropriately and across the ecosystem, I think is important.
Want to add anything, Sridhar?
Yeah, so I'll do a shameless plug. DHS does have an Office of University Programs, but our funding is tiny. So love to extend that partnership. I think I mentioned Texas A&M. We also have centers of excellence, and we'd love to engage if you guys have an interest. We also have University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign that is our center for infrastructure resilience. So absolutely, I think that's a very, very important point that you brought up about academia.
What do you think, Richard?
I mean, yeah, definitely. It's for workforce development, it's key. I mean, so NIST is doing research, right? So we like the open source. That's part of the motivation why we looked at get that open source test bed to be able to get in, learn, prototype new functionalities, right? That otherwise we would not be able to. And we have guest researcher programs, so we also get students from all around the world, and yeah, it's all part of workforce development too.
So before I turn this one over to the audience, I want to ask one last question. So, and this is going to sustaining these efforts, but who should fund them open source projects in general, but also specifically for the open source ORAN, given the US government interest in promoting Open RAN, who should fund them? And if it is the USG, how do you justify the taxpayer dollars going into open source Open RAN? All right, Martin.
That's a hot potato that I'm going to
No, I'll take it on.
That's why we have an academic.
As an IPA, we were talking about this earlier, right? So fire me, Tom. I'll just go back to my cushy academic job. What was the question? No, sustaining. This has to be sustained by the industry. I think the government's role is to get it started and to perhaps provide inputs into the direction of development that we want to see, that are aspects that are important to us. And part of that is actually something that I think about a lot, is how does, what's the profit model for companies in this world? And I think it's not my job to develop those profits, but I think there has to be a path to profitability, because if there's not, this will die. And so as we move forward, we really do have to keep a keen eye on, how do you make money off of this? What are the models for this? We have companies out there now who are in the RAN business, startups and existing companies. We have carriers who use this. Do their business models need to change? What all is involved in finding a path to profitability? But I think it's essential, not for us, essential for us to help people get there. It's not for us to figure out what those models are, though, at least in my opinion.
Well, thank you. Anyone else?
I think you were going to.
She's a civil servant. She can't answer that question.
Okay. So yeah. So,
The only thing I would add is that from our perspective, I don't want to talk about the funding, but specifically, I think it would help us or help you guys if you understood what our needs are and our use cases. For example, having a front end and RIC and real-time RIC, and for it to actually detect interference and do mitigation or avoidance. That might be something that would help the community, and that might be for us to define, what our needs are, what our problem areas are. I think that's something we can do, not to address the funding, but actually to provide incentives for vendors in the marketplace to say, I can potentially do that and generate the revenue or whatever. But I think we can do that.
Well, thank you. So I think, I pretty much agree with Martin that, it has to be an industry-driven effort. The government can actually facilitate that. Because otherwise I don't see how it's going to sustain itself, because the government, when the funding cuts, budget cuts, and the whole thing will collapse. So, okay, thank you for the panel. Maybe if anyone has any questions for the panelists, we can open up. We have a few minutes. Go ahead. There is a microphone. Mic, I see somewhere. Yeah, okay.
I'll be brave. So you've thrown around a bunch of terms that I agree with the open APIs, like pluggable establishment. A big role of that, you've identified, I think, correctly, that conformance doesn't guarantee interoperability, doesn't enable that pluggability. One way to do that is to have a testbed, have both the open source components coming into that testbed, but equally as important, or potentially more important, is the commercial components in that. I'm gonna probably get pitchforked, but the commercial components don't always have that interest in interoperating with their competitors. So what role can your industries, your organizations take in helping to establish those test beds and encourage that participation in an open way to try to create this playing field that actually can enable new people coming in and stuff like that.
So I'll take that one first, if that's okay. So I think we're just starting to scratch the surface there, right? With these, we've got an AT&T test bed, we've got a Viavi test bed, and a Dish test bed. So we're working through how these are going to be stood up and exactly how folks are going to bring components to those test beds to validate things like interoperability. But there'll be a panel later this afternoon where reps from each of those organizations will be there. So I would challenge you to ask them directly exactly how they're going to enable interoperability testing such that you don't have to bring your radio unit back to interoperate with Mavenir versus Ericsson versus Nokia. That's probably a bridge too far at the moment, but how do we get there? How do you get that stamp that says, yes, your RU is interoperable with DU, and it truly is plug and play? That's, I think, where we need to get. So continuing to work with the funding that we provided to help shape how those labs become a reality.
I mean, from a DoD perspective, I mean, we have an acquisitions process, and when we acquire things, we can use that as a crowbar to help companies along the way a little bit. But that's really, I think, the leverage that we have. I don't know, you spent more time in DoD than I did, Amanda. So.
Got a contract, so it's powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is that if we can collectively define what our testing requirements are, and that is the process where they get certified, we can say, if you use federal grant dollars, you have to provide this level of testing and certification. And that's the real hook, right? It's the carrot and stick, right? I mean, that's the only thing that works. At least we've found, based on everything we've done.
No, I mean, I agree with the question. It's not just open source to open source, but open source to commercial, and how you do, show the testing, and, at least having those open source tools, and if there's open source test capabilities as well, it's, could be a minimum, requirement somewhere to say, hey, show that you could, interpret with, those components at least.
I see at least there's two people waiting to ask questions. So this time, I think first come, first serve for the answering. All right, okay, so go ahead. Next question.
Hello. I actually have a specific question for you, Dr. Weiss. My name is Ron Sackman. I work at Boeing. We've been watching 5G BAAs and other opportunities come out from the DoD over the last few years. One thing I would say about them as a generalization, it's not obvious to me what specific use cases the DoD has in mind, and I'll camp on 5G, but it would be analogous for 6G. Could you comment on that? Like, is there a tactical use case that the DoD branches are envisioning for 5G and 6G communications specifically?
There are a variety of use cases that we have for 5G and 6G. Some of them are tactical in nature. Some of them are working, putting 5G on bases with particular needs they have. We've been doing a lot with radar deconfliction kinds of things. Again, my lens is mostly in the applied research area, not so much in the deployment area, so that's really my strength. But I mean, we're looking at non-terrestrial networks. We really have a bunch of different use cases that we're considering. I mean, I would encourage you to go back to the overview slides that Tom presented earlier, where we were looking at these different lines of effort that we have. Each one of those has particular use cases that are distinct from each other.
I would say hold that question for Arpit, that will moderate one of the sessions with Tom and Amanda in the afternoon. So maybe you can ask again so they can get a little bit more specific. Maybe one more question? Or let's see, maybe two more. We can go. Okay. We have 3 minutes.
Yeah, hi. One comment first and one question. So comment was, I think there's more than just catalyst that is possible from the government side. There is potentially leverage that, for example, just a thought of FCC, let's say spectrum for Open RAN was incentivized in a way that like Europe is incentivizing spectrum or Open RAN in different ways, but FCC spectrum auction, availability of spectrum, that's a big one. I don't know if the departments are considering that. I'll let that comment stand, and Amanda, if you want to answer that or not. But the second question really was, so Open RAN adoption is already, shall we say, not going as fast as maybe some would like. Perhaps there's risk and performance challenges that we talked about. Does adding open source to the mix help that, hurt that? Is there any thoughts around that?
Go ahead.
Okay. So to the first question about whole of government, the government, I think, is represented here, right? We've got a cross-department grouping here today. We are talking at high levels. Our bosses are discussing sort of all the levers that we have as a government to try to facilitate Open RAN. So no specifics, but considering all of the options on the table, right? In terms of Open RAN deployment and trying to facilitate that moving more quickly, I think, from our perspective, we have tried to facilitate the MVP taking hold, being that first step for vendors that are new to the ecosystem, making it easier for them to get in. If there are other areas that are pain points that you think the government could potentially be a resource to buy down that risk, I think we're all open to understanding what those are, and if there's challenges that maybe we're not aware of, I think we'd all be open to understanding that. So, from my perspective, again, looking at a strategy about injecting resources where we think it makes the most sense, and being cognizant that we really do only have a little bit to prime the pump, how do we leverage that most effectively?
Okay, let's take the last question.
Thanks, SJ. A comment and kind of an open question. So going back to the question of sustainable models for open source, this is a topic that's very, very close to my heart as the owner of a small business. Time and time again, what I've seen is that the most sustainable model for open source is where there is a consumer who's ingesting that open source and deploying it in production. A dependent consumer of that solution, because that dependent consumer is going to invest in and sustain the project. One of my questions is, in general, for a US government as a massive consumer, are there opportunities? So firstly, I agree completely that funding is needed to catalyze the initial effort to get to the point where that is a deployable product. But as a huge consumer, are there opportunities for the US government to drive the consumption of those open source projects and help to make them sustainable?
30 seconds, Sridhar.
Okay. Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. Level and scale matter. I think Amanda nailed it. If you look at one of the large carriers, we went through that whole activities with FirstNet. Right, we gave them $7 billion to establish a nationwide public safety network. Well, guess what? That doesn't even cover O&M costs from a carrier for a single year. So I think we can drive and we can be a catalyst, but really the amount of money being invested from the carriers and from the open market is much more than we can drive.
Well, I think that's it. Those questions are really good questions. And because we are out of time, we're going to wrap up here. But I would say stay for the afternoon sessions. And we have several other panels. And you're going to see these same people and others involved in these afternoon panels. So you can actually bring up some of those questions and drill down the nuances. I think they are important questions. And the whole point of, I think, this workshop or the mini summit is exactly to address those concerns and try to clear out any uncertain points about what is the government approach, how we see the open source and Open RAN going to evolve in the near future. So thank you so much, and let's thank the panel. See you guys again in the afternoon.
Hey,
All right.
thank you, SK, for